True war encounters. Desmond Doss. They claimed the ridge belonged to weapons. He reclaimed it with resolve. The rope hung over the cliff edge like a question no one wanted to answer. Desmond Doss stood at the base of Hacksaw Ridge in the fading light of May 5, 1945, watching stretcher-bearers stumble down the muddy slope with the last of the evacuated wounded. Above them, the plateau that the 77th Infantry Division had fought for all day stretched into darkness, swallowed by smoke and the approaching night. The ridge had fallen silent, but it was the silence of abandonment. Around him, exhausted soldiers gathered in small clusters, faces blank with shock and relief. They'd survived, they'd made it down. Officers moved among them, counting heads, checking weapons, organizing the withdrawal to safer ground below. The assault had failed. The Japanese positions had held. Now the only sensible choice was to pull back, regroup and try again tomorrow with better support. But from somewhere up on that ridge, voices still called out. Faint, desperate pleas that carried on the evening wind. "Medic! Somebody help me!" Doss tightened his grip on his nearly empty medical satchel. His hands were shaking, had been shaking since mid-afternoon, when the first mortars had started falling on the plateau. Around him, men avoided looking at the cliff. They knew what those cries meant. Wounded soldiers were scattered across the top, stranded in the open or hidden in shell craters, unable to move on their own. A captain nearby was speaking into a field radio, his voice tight with frustration. "Roger that. All units withdrawing to rally point. The ridge is too hot to hold without reinforcements." He glanced at the cliff, jaw working. "We'll come back for the wounded at first light." First light. 12 hours away, maybe more. Doss felt something crack open inside his chest, a familiar weight he'd carried since training, the gap between what made tactical sense and what his conscience could bear. He'd joined the army to save lives, not to leave men to die in the dark because the ground was too dangerous to defend. He looked at the rope. Someone, probably engineers during the initial assault, had rigged it over the cliff edge as an evacuation line, securing it around a blasted tree stump at the top. Men had used it to lower casualties during the day. Now it just hung there, fraying slightly where it rubbed against the rock, waiting. "Doss, you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." He turned. Private Miller stood beside him, a rifleman from Tennessee who'd joked with him that morning about carrying bandages instead of bullets. Miller's uniform was caked with mud, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "They gave the order. We're pulling back." "The wounded are still up there," Doss said quietly, "and the Japs are still up there too." Miller's voice cracked. "You go back up that ridge in the dark. They'll kill you before you find anybody." Doss adjusted his helmet, checking the straps on his satchel. His throat felt tight, his stomach twisted with fear so sharp it hurt to breathe. Every rational part of his mind agreed with Miller. Going back up was suicide. The ridge belonged to whoever had the guns, and right now that meant the enemy. But he'd never been good at listening to the rational part. "Somebody's got to try," he said, and started walking toward the cliff. Behind him, Miller swore softly. "You're insane." "You know that?" "Maybe." But Doss had learned long ago that faith and fear could occupy the same space inside a man's chest, and sometimes you just had to move forward anyway, one step at a time, trusting that the next foothold would appear. The rope felt rough under his burned palms as he tested its strength. Above him, the plateau waited, dark, deadly, and full of men who needed help more than they needed weapons. He whispered a prayer he'd been repeating all day. "Lord, please help me get one more." Then he started to climb. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The climb felt endless. Doss's boots slipped on wet rock, his medical satchel banging against his hip with each pull upward. Below him, voices shouted for him to come back, but the rope kept his attention, rough hemp biting into his palms, the only solid thing in a world that had become smoke and shadow. When he reached the top, the plateau spread before him like a broken promise. What had been a tree line that morning was now a field of splintered stumps and craters. Shell holes held rainwater that reflected the last grey light of dusk. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Japanese machine gun positions waited, invisible but listening, and scattered across that shattered ground were the wounded. Doss moved in a crouch, whispering their names, listening for responses. The first man he found was Corporal Jackson from Alabama, gut-shot and delirious, half buried in mud at the edge of a crater. Doss knelt beside him, pressing the last clean bandages from his satchel into the wound, murmuring reassurances he wasn't sure were true. Getting Jackson to the cliff edge took 20 minutes of dragging, stopping, praying, dragging again. Every sound made Doss freeze, the distant crack of bamboo, the scrape of metal on stone, voices in Japanese carrying across the plateau. Once, muzzle flashes lit up the darkness 200 yards to his left. He pressed himself flat, Jackson groaning beneath him, and waited for bullets that never came. At the rope, Doss improvised a harness using torn uniform strips and his own belt, looping it under Jackson's arms. His hands trembled as he worked, fumbling with knots he'd practiced 100 times in training. The descent was agony. Jackson's weight testing every fiber of the rope, Doss bracing against the cliff edge, lowering him hand over hand while his shoulders screamed. When Jackson reached the bottom, soldiers caught him with shocked exclamations. "How many more are up there?" someone shouted. Doss didn't answer. He was already climbing back up. The second man was Private Yoshida, a Nisei translator who'd taken shrapnel to the leg. The third was a lieutenant whose name Doss never learned, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Each evacuation followed the same brutal pattern: find, stabilize, drag, lower. The rope became everything: lifeline, anchor, prayer, made tangible. Between trips, Doss scavenged supplies from the dead. Canteens, bandages torn from clean sections of uniform, a morphine syringe clutched in a cold hand. He whispered apologies to men who couldn't hear him anymore, then moved on to those who still could. Below the cliff, a small crowd had gathered. Soldiers who'd written off the ridge as lost now stood watching. One man refused to accept that logic. Captain Glover, the company commander, stared through binoculars, his face unreadable in the dim light. Beside him, a medic from the aid station kept count on a notepad, numbering each man Doss sent down. "That's 8, the medic said quietly. 9, Jesus, he's going back up again." Miller stood among them, rifle forgotten, watching the rope swing and tighten with each descent. Earlier that day, he'd questioned whether a medic without a weapon belonged on the front line. Now he questioned everything he thought he knew about courage. On his 12th trip up, Doss's legs nearly gave out. Exhaustion had become a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders. His throat was raw from whispering prayers. His hands, torn and bleeding, could barely grip the rope. But somewhere in the darkness, another voice called, "Medic." Just one more, he told himself. Then another, then another. The night deepened. The rope held. Midnight brought fog that rolled across the plateau in thick waves, turning everything beyond 10 feet into ghosts and suggestions. Doss welcomed it. The fog meant cover. It also meant getting lost, disoriented, turned around in a landscape where a wrong step could send him over the cliff or straight into enemy lines. He'd stopped counting trips. Time had become a rhythm. Climb, search, drag, lower, pray, repeat. His body moved on instinct now, muscle memory carrying him when thought failed. The rope had worn grooves into his palms. Blood made his grip slick, but he didn't let go. Somewhere around his 20th evacuation, he found Private Chen, pinned under a collapsed section of timber from a destroyed bunker. It took 10 minutes of digging with bare hands to free him, all while Japanese voices drifted through the fog less than 50 yards away. Chen couldn't walk. Doss fashioned a drag stretcher from 2 broken rifle stocks and a poncho, pulling him across the plateau an inch at a time. At the cliff edge, the rope had started to fray. Doss could feel it under his fingers. Fibers separating, the whole line weakening under the constant strain of lowering body after body. He tested each section before trusting it with another man's weight, whispering prayers that had become as automatic as breathing. Below, the aid station had erupted into organized chaos. Doctors worked under dim lanterns, performing triage on the stream of casualties Doss kept sending down. They'd run out of morphine an hour ago. Bandages were being recycled, washed quickly in iodine solution, and reused. Nobody had expected this many survivors from a ridge everyone thought was lost. Captain Glover watched it all with the numb expression of a man whose understanding of what was possible had been fundamentally shaken. He'd given the withdrawal order based on sound tactical judgment. Hold the ridge with the forces available? Impossible. Go back for the wounded in darkness against entrenched positions? Suicide. And yet that unarmed medic kept proving him wrong, one rope-lowered soldier at a time. "Should we send someone up to help him?" Lieutenant Morrison asked. Glover shook his head slowly. "He's the only one who knows where they all are. And he's—" He paused, searching for words. "He's the only one who won't stop." On the ridge, Doss found Sergeant Kowalski in a shell crater, both legs shattered, convinced he'd been abandoned. "You came back," Kowalski whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought nobody was coming back." "I'm here," Doss said simply, applying tourniquets with hands that shook so badly he could barely tie the knots. "You're going home." The journey to the cliff edge took forever. Kowalski was heavy. The ground was treacherous, and twice Doss had to freeze as Japanese patrols passed within yards, their footsteps crunching on debris. He held his breath, pressed flat in the mud, and prayed harder than he'd ever prayed in his life. When he finally got Kowalski over the edge and started lowering him, the rope groaned. A section near the top began to separate, individual strands popping with small sounds like distant gunfire. Doss braced his feet, taking more weight, talking to the rope like it was alive. "Hold, just hold a little longer." It held 43 men. That's how many the medic at the aid station had counted when Doss climbed up again, his silhouette disappearing into the fog like something that shouldn't be real. Miller turned to the soldier beside him. "How long can one man keep doing this?" Nobody had an answer. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope became the center of everything, the spine of an impossible night, the thread connecting life and death. By 2 a.m., Doss had descended and climbed it so many times his hands moved automatically, finding holds on the cliff face his eyes could no longer see clearly. The rope itself had become a living chronicle of the rescue, marked by blood, mud, and the slow separation of fibers under impossible strain. Each trip taught him something new about the ridge's geography in darkness. The shell crater 30 paces from the cliff edge that served as a landmark, the snapped tree trunk he could use for cover when pausing to catch his breath. The paths between positions where wounded men called out, their voices growing weaker as shock and blood loss took hold. Private Anderson had been hit in the chest, each breath a wet rattle. Doss stuffed the wound with gauze he'd scavenged from a dead soldier's pack, then dragged him through the mud, while Anderson gripped his arm with fading strength. "Don't leave me," Anderson whispered. "Please don't leave me." "Not leaving anybody," Doss promised, though his own body screamed for rest. His legs trembled with each step. His vision blurred from exhaustion, but those hands on his arm, that desperate grip, it was more binding than any order, more powerful than any fear. At the cliff edge, the rope had worn through in 3 places, barely holding together. Doss reinforced it with strips torn from his own uniform, knotting them around the weak sections, testing his weight before trusting it with Anderson's. The descent took twice as long, Doss moving in inches, feeling every strand of hemp stretch and groan. When Anderson reached safety, the doctor looked up at Doss, still perched on the cliff edge. "How many more?" "Don't know," Doss called down. "As many as I can find." The night had a strange quality now, Time stretched and compressed simultaneously. Minutes became hours, became minutes again. Doss found men in impossible places, wedged in collapsed bunkers, half buried in crater walls, draped over the edge of trenches. Each one became the center of his world for however long it took to stabilize and move them. Around 3 a.m., he made a mistake. Exhausted and disoriented in the fog, he grabbed what he thought was his canteen and took a long drink before realizing it was someone else's, and that it contained something stronger than water. The alcohol hit his empty stomach like fire. For a moment his vision swam, and he had to brace against a tree stump until the world stopped spinning. Fear seized him then, pure and cold. What if he couldn't find his way back to the rope? What if his shaking hands finally failed and he dropped someone over the cliff? What if the next patrol didn't pass by but came straight toward him? He knelt in the mud, head bowed, and for the first time that night couldn't find words for prayer. His mind was empty, except for exhaustion and terror, and the overwhelming certainty that he had nothing left to give. But then, drifting through the fog, is someone there? Please, somebody help. Doss lifted his head. His hands were still shaking, his legs still felt like water. But the voice was real, and there was still rope left. And somewhere in the deep places of his faith was the strength for one more, just one more. He stood, oriented himself by the stars barely visible through the fog, and moved toward the voice. The rope held him. The cliff became familiar. The rhythm continued. What the citation would later say, Private First Class Desmond T. Doss repeatedly braved intense enemy fire to evacuate wounded soldiers from Hacksaw Ridge, lowering 75 men to safety. What the citation would never mention, the moment he broke. It came around 4 a.m., with maybe a dozen men left to find. Doss had just finished lowering Corporal Hayes, a kid from Wisconsin who'd been calling for his mother in delirium. The rope had nearly snapped during the descent, one section fraying down to barely a handful of intact strands. Doss had felt it giving way beneath his hands and had thrown his whole weight backward, bracing against the cliff edge, holding the line together through sheer force of will and prayer. When Hayes reached the bottom and the rope went slack, Doss didn't climb back up immediately. He couldn't. His arms refused to move. His hands, torn and bleeding, hung useless at his sides. The rope swayed in the night wind, and for the first time since starting this insane mission, he couldn't make himself reach for it. He sat on the edge of the cliff, legs dangling over darkness, and felt everything he'd been holding back crash over him. The fear he'd been suppressing for hours, the exhaustion that made his bones feel hollow. The faces of men he'd treated who died anyway, their blood on his hands meaning nothing in the end. And underneath it all, a terrible doubt. What if this was all futile? What if he was just delaying the inevitable? What if the men he was saving would die tomorrow anyway, or next week, or next month, and all this suffering was for nothing? The prayer wouldn't come. That simple mantra, "Lord, help me get one more," had carried him through every trip up the rope, but now his mind was blank, his faith suddenly as frayed as the rope itself. Below him, soldiers were calling up, asking if he was okay, but their voices sounded distant and unreal. He stared at his hands in the dim light and saw them shaking uncontrollably. These weren't the hands of a hero. They were the hands of a terrified kid from Lynchburg, Virginia, who'd convinced himself he could save everyone, and was now learning the hard lesson about what bodies and minds can actually endure. For a long moment, Desmond Doss sat on that cliff and seriously considered not going back up, considered telling them he'd done enough, that someone else needed to finish, considered the warm safety of the aid station and sleep and letting someone else carry the weight. Then from somewhere on the plateau, faint but unmistakable, "Medic, please, anybody." Doss closed his eyes. His hands were still shaking. His faith still felt broken. His body still insisted it had nothing left. But that voice was real, and that man was waiting. And the only thing Doss knew with absolute certainty was that he couldn't listen to that cry and do nothing. So he didn't pray. He didn't ask for strength or guidance or miraculous intervention. He simply reached for the rope with hands that trembled and didn't trust themselves, and he climbed. The next ascent was the hardest of the night. Not because of enemy fire or difficult terrain, but because he did it without the certainty that had carried him before. He climbed on empty, on fumes, on nothing but stubborn refusal to abandon someone who needed help. He found Private Santiago trapped under debris, evacuated him, and moved on to the next, and the next. And somewhere in that mechanical continuation, the prayer returned, not as spiritual certainty, but as something simpler, a rhythm to match his movements, a way to keep his mind from stopping along with his body. Dawn broke pale and grey over Okinawa just before 6 a.m., May 6, 1945. Desmond Doss made his final descent from Hacksaw Ridge as the sun touched the edge of the plateau behind him, turning the smoke and fog from grey to gold. He didn't walk down. His legs gave out at the bottom of the rope, and he collapsed into the arms of soldiers who'd been watching all night. Someone tried to count his wounds. Rope burns that had stripped skin to raw meat, cuts from metal and rock, bruises that covered his arms and shoulders. But Doss just shook his head mutely. He wasn't wounded. He was just done. The doctor from the aid station approached with a notepad, his face grave. "We counted 75. 75 men you brought down from up there." Doss stared at him without comprehension. Numbers meant nothing. He could only think in faces, in hands he'd held, in voices that had called out from darkness. Captain Glover stood nearby, already composing the after-action report in his head. He would write about exceptional valor and complete disregard for personal safety. He would use phrases like "went above and beyond" and "inspirational leadership." The report would be clean, heroic, suitable for citations and medals. It would not mention the medic sitting in the mud, hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold a canteen. It would not capture the hollow look in his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, the prayers he whispered to himself that sounded more like desperate bargaining than faith. The report would tell what Doss had done. It could never tell what it had cost. 2 months later, Desmond Doss would receive the Medal of Honor from President Truman. The ceremony would be formal, precise, full of words about bravery and sacrifice. Doss would stand at attention in a dress uniform, his scarred hands hidden in white gloves, and accept the medal with humility. He would never tell them about the moment on the cliff edge when he couldn't pray, about the rope he still felt cutting into his palms in dreams, about how he counted faces instead of sheep when he couldn't sleep, making sure he hadn't forgotten anyone, hadn't left someone behind. Years later, in the quiet of his Tennessee home, when rain drummed on the roof and the smell of wet rope drifted from somewhere in memory, Doss would close his eyes and be back on that ridge. Not the heroic version from the citation, the real version. Terrified, exhausted, broken, continuing anyway because stopping meant listening to those voices calling from darkness. His wife would sometimes find him sitting by the window on rainy nights, his hands unconsciously making the motions of tying knots, testing rope, lowering invisible weight. She learned not to ask. Some things lived too deep for words. The ridge itself became a footnote in larger battles. Okinawa fell. The war ended. The cliff face where Desmond Doss spent one impossible night became just another piece of ground, marked on maps but holding no special significance except to those who'd been there. But for 75 men, and their children and their grandchildren, that night meant everything. They would grow old telling stories about the medic who wouldn't stop, who wouldn't quit, who climbed that rope again and again when everyone else had given up. And Desmond Doss would listen to those stories sometimes, at reunions and memorial services, and recognize pieces of that night in them. But he'd also recognize what was missing, the weight of the rope in hands that couldn't grip anymore, the fog that turned everything uncertain, the moment when faith cracked and he kept moving anyway. They said the ridge belonged to weapons, to firepower, tactical advantage, violent force. And for years afterward, military analysts would study that night and try to fit it into doctrine, how one man accomplished what entire units could not. But Doss knew the real truth, the one that couldn't fit in after-action reports or medal citations. He reclaimed that ridge with something more fragile and more powerful than any weapon. The simple, stubborn, terrified resolve to reach for one more hand in the darkness, even when everything in him screamed to stop. The rope was retired after that night, too damaged for further use. Doss never knew what happened to it. But sometimes, in dreams, he could still feel it, rough hemp biting into scarred palms, holding fast when nothing else would. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel. Tell us which country you watch from and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.